Good afternoon, and we're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Public Policy Institute of California, and we want to thank you for coming out today. For those of you not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank with offices in San Francisco and, of course, glorious Sacramento. PPIC has just released a new report titled School Resources and the Local Control Funding Formula: Is Increased Spending Reaching High-Needs Students?, which is authored by PPIC Research Fellow Julien Lafortune. Sorry about that. We'd like to thank the Dirk and Charlene Capsano Foundation and the Stewart Foundation for their support of this work and for the lunch today. You should have received copies of the report on your chair, and there are additional copies at the registration table. There's also a wonderful appendix if you're into real nice deep data dives. The report, the technical appendices, the slides from today's presentation are also available online at ppic.org. For today's program, we're going to first hear from Julien, who will present the main findings from the report. Then CalMatters education reporter Ricardo Cano will moderate a discussion with a fantastic panel of experts. We want to thank them for coming. And finally, you should have plenty of time for audience question and answer. You should have received an agenda on your chair, and all the speakers' bios are on the back of that agenda. So in the interest of time, we'll only do brief reintroductions today. Please note that we will also have an online audience today, so be sure to wait for microphones during the question and answer so they can hear your questions. And a couple of things before we begin. Later today, you will receive a survey from PPIC. Yeah, we love our surveys, and we ask that you respond to those because we do read those and take your suggestions. And lastly, turn off and please silence your cell phones. In 2013, Governor Brown signed into law a new funding formula. Instead of equalizing per pupil funding like the legislature had been trying to do for a number of years, the local control funding formula was designed to send additional funding to special districts, as the Jerry Brown was quoted as saying, where the need and the challenge is the greatest. The passage of this proposal was no easy task. The LCFF fundamentally asked districts with lower concentration of LCFF eligible kids to grow slower than those schools with high concentrations. And while school finance is traditionally, major school finance reform has been done at the ballot, Prop 98, or required by the courts, Serrano, this measure was going through the legislature. For some members of the legislature, this meant they were voting for a formula change that would deliver less money to their school districts than under existing laws. Members generally don't like that. They're kind of funny that way. It is a testament to the architects of this measure and the argument that the greatest need and the greatest challenge were compelling that LCFF passed at all. Since the passage of this change, issues have been raised about how this targeted funding is being spent. At issue are concerns that some of the LCFF money intended to support services for the 3 at-risk subgroups may be siphoned off for other uses. How have these concerns been raised? In the legislature have been numerous bills. 2 years ago, legislators considered legislation that would have required to report actual per pupil spending at a site disaggregated by base, supplemental, and concentration grants. Most recently, the Joint Audit Committee has authorized an audit that will examine how LCFF money has been used at 3 large school districts in different parts of the state. The audit is expected back in November. Locally, there have been challenges to local control accountability plans. And for the general public, this issue may seem a little confusing when they go online and they see a number of financial reports. But as it turns out, California doesn't provide financial comprehensive information at a school site level or have a longitudinal data system, but that's a whole nother report we're interested in. And while there is a new federal requirement in the ESSA to report actual per pupil expenditures by object of expenditure and funding source at both the LEA and individual school site level, that federal requirement has been delayed several times. Julien, our author, recently joined PPIC, and this is his first public appearance for us, and we're really glad to have him. You can imagine our delight when we discussed this issue, and he said he might be able to devise a way to calculate school-level funding data. So a description of that he'll go through in his presentation. We're very excited to have Julien join PPIC, and we know that his work in education finance will help inform this important topic and other topics in the future. And so now I'll turn the program over to Julien. Welcome.
All right, thanks Deborah. Thanks everyone for coming out today. So I'm excited to get to present some of this work. This is, again, as Deborah mentioned, my first solo report at PPIC, looking at how the LCFF has affected districts, and in particular high-need districts, and how the spending patterns have changed in response to LCFF, and really trying to get at some of these key questions, like how are districts allocating money within to different school sites that are often of differing levels of need. And so I think it's first helpful to go through a little bit of background on LCFF and really what it's about. And so broadly speaking, there's really three major goals of LCFF, of the reform. And the first is to simplify the funding streams in our K-12 system. The second is to revamp our system of accountability. And the third and most important is to increase funding for those high-need students. And the way LCFF defines high-need students is those who are low-income English language learners, homeless, and/or foster youth. And this reform really involved two fundamental components. And the first is that it's a weighted funding formula. And what this means is that districts get an additional percentage on top of their base grant per student to fund, or they get an additional grant on top of their base grant for those additional high-need students that they enroll. And then the second component of this is that districts have more local control. So gone are the days of several categorical funding streams. Districts are now given more leeway and fewer restrictions in terms of how they can spend these dollars, with the expectation and the requirement that they're spending this in the places and on the students who have the greatest need. And so what does this look like in terms of the funding formula itself? This is often referred to as kind of the hockey stick graph, and what it shows is the percentage increase in funding over the base grant dependent on a district's share of high-need students. And so what you can see is up to the 55% threshold of high-need students, districts get what's called a supplemental grant for each high-need student. So a district with, say, 25% high need will get a supplemental grant that basically allots them about 5% more funding per student in terms of ADA. At the 55% threshold, we see this large kink, and that's where the concentration grants kick in. And this is out of an acknowledgement that not only is it more expensive or it's more difficult to educate students who are higher need, but it may be more difficult in places that have more or a higher concentration of need in those districts. And one thing that I'll point out in this report and also in the presentation is that I'll be splitting districts into three broad groups. So those who receive concentration grants at the 55% threshold and above, which I'll refer to as the high need districts. There are those of more moderate need in this 30 to 55% range that receive some additional supplemental funding, but not as much as a concentration district. And then there are the lower need districts with 30% or below high need students that receive a little bit of extra funding under LCFF, but really aren't as impacted by the funding formula itself. And so this funding formula and this reform towards more local control really begs some key questions that I'm going to try to get at in this report. And the first is, how has LCFF really affected district spending, and how are they spending this money, especially in those high need districts and those places where we've really targeted the additional funding? And then the second and also very important one is, how has this actually affected the educational environment that students face in terms of things that are kind of quantifiable and comparable across districts? So not just in terms of dollars, but class sizes, teacher credentials, teacher experience, support staff levels, things of that nature. And then the third, and this is where I'm offering a bit of a new take on some of the spending data, is how are districts targeting the students or the highest need students in their own district? And as Deborah mentioned, there's a data limitation here. School spending and school resources aren't really reported systematically at the site level. And so the way that I get around this is by building essentially a pseudo school level spending database from the ground up, using information on teacher salaries that I get from teacher salary schedules and demographics. So this is only telling part of the picture, but it's a step in the direction towards what is a new kind of school level spending database, which is perhaps what we can expect with the new ESSA requirements, although that remains to be seen. And so splitting again these districts in between those that are kind of very high need with 55% above and then those of more moderate or lower need, we can see a picture that emerges over time over the past 15 years in terms of student spending. And what I'm referring to as student spending here is everything that a district spends with the exception of capital, of debt service, of pre-K and adult education. So this makes up about 80% of the total district's expenditures per year per pupil. And so what we can see is a broad pattern that district spending went up pretty rapidly or substantially in the era prior to the recession. District spending took a large hit during the recession, and then since the passage of LCFF in the 2013-2014 fiscal year, we've seen a large increase in spending across all districts, but a relatively larger increase in those highest need districts. And one thing that's important to point out is that these high need districts, those who are on the top line in orange, have actually been spending more per pupil since before LCFF. But if we're really interested in the impact of the funding formula itself, aside from just the general improvement in the economic situation in the state, what we really want is what is the relative increase in those highest need districts compared to the lower need districts that didn't benefit as much under the formula. And so a simple way that we can visualize this is just by recentering spending relative to where a district was at in 2012 prior to LCFF. So when we do this, a picture emerges that basically shows districts moved roughly in unison for the 10 years prior to LCFF, both up and down in before and after the recession. And it's really with the introduction of LCFF and this fundamental reform that we see a divergence between those highest need districts and other districts that didn't get as much funding in the formula. And in terms of a dollar amount, comparing those high need districts with 55% of and above to the lower need districts, at 0 to 30%, it's about a $530 increase per student by 2017 in terms of per pupil funding. And so that's a pretty sizable effect, which then begs the question, well, what are they spending this money on? And what I find when I look at that is that districts are spending more, broadly speaking, of all levels, are spending more on staffing, and in particular on instructional staff, which isn't so much of a surprise given that that's one of the main expenditures that a school district will have. But one interesting thing that came out of this is that districts that are both high and lower need are spending about the same, or they've seen about the same increase since LCFF in instructional expenditures. Where the relative increase for the highest need districts has really come from is on non-teacher spending, or what I'll call non-teacher spending. And these are really pupil services, support staff. These are some admin costs, some staff benefit costs, and also a lot of other kind of non-staff expenditures that are germane to the student, like professional development, classroom materials, textbooks, and equipment replacement and things of that nature. And so to this point, I've been talking about what's happening at the district level. But as we know, LCFF is targeting districts, but we care about these high need students themselves. And there are actually hundreds of thousands of high need students in lower need districts. On the flip side, there are hundreds of thousands of kind of what we would call non-high need students, or students who aren't targeted under the LCFF formula, that go to school in districts that receive substantial additional funding under the concentration grants. And so if we just start from the naive baseline assumption that districts spend roughly equally on their students, which may or may not be true, then what we get is that relative increase, that $530 number that I mentioned before, is actually attenuated when we look at the difference in spending that's evolved at the student level. So comparing high versus non-high need students, that increase isn't as large. And the reason is it by design of the LCFF. We're targeting district level need and not school or student level need. But with that said, the intention and the requirement under LCFF is that districts are supposed to spend this money on the students for whom it was intended. And this is particularly important in many contexts because there are large gaps in socioeconomic status and in poverty levels across districts or across schools in the same districts. And so what I'll show in this graph is one way of visualizing these socioeconomic gaps between schools in the same district. So what I'm showing here, each bubble is a district. The larger bubbles represent larger districts. And then on the vertical axis, this is the gap in the average poverty level between the highest poverty and the lowest poverty quartiles or quarters of schools. So to point out one, you can kind of see the largest bubble there at about 80%. That's LA Unified. 80% of the students in LA Unified roughly are high need students, and they have a cross-school poverty gap of about 50 percentage points. So what that means is that a student in Los Angeles Unified that attends one of the highest poverty schools is on average attending a school that's 50% higher in terms of its share of low-income students than a student who's attending one of the wealthier quarter of schools in Los Angeles on average. And I think what's apparent when looking at this graph is this kind of inverted U shape, at least that's what stood out to me, And some of this is mechanical. Obviously, districts that are between 0 and 10 or 90 and above can't really have large differences across their schools in terms of poverty levels. But districts more in the middle of the distribution, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that they have these large gaps, but they do. And this is something that's often just a pattern of or due to existing patterns of residential socioeconomic segregation, which have been well reported on. So this kind of begs the question then, how are these districts that see these large differences between their highest and lowest poverty schools, are they actually targeting this additional LCFF funding towards the students who need it the most, or are they spending roughly equally? And of course, we don't have the best data on that, but looking just in terms of teacher spending, we can start to tease out some of this relationship. So again, using data just on what is spent on teachers that's associated down to the site level, I actually find that districts are spending more on their highest need schools to the tune of about $200 to $300 more per student, at least on average across the state. And this is actually a pattern that's predated LCFF. So it doesn't look like LCFF has impacted this kind of relative distribution. This pattern of slightly higher spending in their highest need schools has existed and continues to go on. So the dollars are being targeted, but not in a differential way over time. However, one thing that I find is they're achieving this higher level of spending in their higher poverty schools by essentially lowering class sizes almost to the extent, or they're lowering class sizes, but using less experienced and due to the salary schedules, lower paid educators. And so this represents a trade-off of sorts between teacher qualifications and pupil-teacher ratios. The higher need schools are seeing more adults in the classroom or in the building, but these educators are often more likely to be novice and less experienced, and due to the way that we structure salaries, they're paid less. So in spite of this, they're spending a little bit more, but this spending difference that is slightly progressive is actually, masking some of these large gaps that represent a trade-off between class size and teacher experience. And so I think this hits at some key implications, and obviously there's more we can continue to do and understand about these spending differences within district. But really, I think to me, the key thing that I discovered in this report is that these insofar as novice hires are initially less effective, it may mean that these improvements in student outcomes will take some time to accumulate, and the effects of LCFF that we really care about, which are we closing achievement gaps? Are we lifting up these highest need students to higher levels of achievement? That may actually take some time. New teachers tend not to be as effective in their first few years, and so we may want to think about efforts that can either help schools or help districts try to hire and retain effective educators and more qualified educators in the schools that need it the most. That could involve policies that involve differential pay, or it could involve policies that relieve teacher shortages, which are a big problem. But this is something that I think we need to be thinking about more, especially if we're caring about how we target these resources to these highest need students. And then the final thing, and I don't want to beleaguer just a mindless plug for data, but really better data to track site level spending could be a big boon if we won't care about monitoring where LCFF funding is going. So to the extent that we have concerns that districts may not be spending money where we think it's most effective or where it's intended, we really need better data and better accounting to account for the spending decisions at the site and not necessarily the district level. And I think the LCAPs, or the local control and accountability plans, they achieve some of this, but as many of you in this room are probably aware of or have experienced, this is a messy process. It's contentious, it's imperfect, and maybe this isn't where we necessarily want to go in the future if we want greater kind of monitoring of these financial goals. Deborah mentioned earlier these ESSA requirements under the federal government. I think this is a step in the right direction. It remains to be seen what we'll be able to learn from this, but it represents a positive step that I think could really, in the end, help improve the efficacy of LCFF and more generally targeting resources to students with the greatest need. So again, thank you everyone for being here. I'll be available for questions after the panel. We'll have a Q&A session, but at this time, I'd like to pass it along to our wonderful moderator, Ricardo Cano from CalMatters, and he'll introduce the rest of the panel. So thank you again, everyone, and I'm excited to hear about what the panel has to say.
And thank you, Julian, for a great presentation. My name is Ricardo Cano. I cover education for CalMatters here in Sacramento. And we have a great panel lined up to talk about the report and LCFF. I'm here with Dr. Michael Kirst, former president of the California State Board of Education, emeritus professor of education at Stanford University, and a key architect of the local control funding formula. Kent Kern, superintendent of San Juan Unified School District, serving 50,000 kids in the greater Sacramento region, and he's a homegrown product of San Juan Public Schools. And Samantha Tran, Senior Managing Director of Education Policy at Children Now Child Advocacy Group. So I think it'd be great to break the ice here a little and just start off with, what was the single most important takeaway for each of you from this report, starting with Dr. Kirst.
Well, as one of the architects of the local control funding formula, I don't think I would have done the study quite the way it was done. And so my takeaway is I'd like to see more detail, and I'll be specific. I think that the concentration theory that we had of over 55% and its impact is somewhat masked by the way the study was designed. It has three buckets: 0 to 30%, 30 to 55%, and then high need is 55% and above. So in high need is both the district to my left, San Juan Unified, and Stockton. And I've been in both of those districts in the last 6 months, and believe me, Stockton is quite different in my view from San Juan Unified. When you put all of those in the bucket, in the same big bucket as over 55%, then you really don't, to me, isolate the impact on concentration. So there was a hockey stick there as it goes up on the 55, and I'd like to have seen a breakout for, let's say, the districts above 75%, for example, and not lump them all together, which I think makes a difference. And when I first read it, it didn't fit my intuition because I've talked to places like Stockton, Alum Rock, Oceanside, and I said, your spending's up about, at the LCFF, if you take the full funding, their spending per pupil is up by about 50%. Yet this study is showing a $530 difference, and so it just doesn't quite fit with how I think about it. Our theory of concentration in designing LCFF was inspired, for example, by William Julius Wilson's study of Chicago, where he looked at the, quote, truly disadvantaged and very, very impacted, highly impacted school districts. And I have a whole file of data about concentration, poverty, and its effects. And therefore, that's where we were trying to have the biggest impact, up at the top of that hockey stick. And so maybe there's something I'm missing, but I've talked to other experts and it doesn't seem that way. And so that's the first thing. And then I think you'll come back to this. I don't think we can get to better school site understanding with the existing SACS codes we have, which are on table 1 in this study. When you put in the buckets, instructional salaries, pupil services and support staff salaries, administrative salaries, when you have those big a bucket, you can't really find out what the instructional spending is that's behind that and what is going on. I started in the Bureau of the Budget in 1964 in the federal government, and I said, show me the school accounting codes. This is 1964. And there was in figure 1 in this report. I don't know how many, these are national school spending codes, and I don't know how many businesses still do their accounting codes the same in 2019 they did in 1964. And so I believe these buckets are so flawed that trying to tease out school site spending from them in a total way, understanding not just salaries, but what is really being spent on programs and other things, I think that's like trying to put a rocket on the back of a stagecoach, and you can't get there from here. And we have to have a much more fundamental overhaul of how we think about school accounting and the categories we put it in.
Superintendent Kern?
Probably one of my big takeaways when I read the study was in San Juan Unified, we're currently just below that concentration mark at 54.5%. So we do not receive any concentration dollars, but out of the 64 schools we have, 19 of them are at 80% or above, and they're on duplicated counts. And 7 of those are above 90%, but we do not receive any concentration dollars. And we would say those are the highest needs students in the state. And yet one of my schools that's actually at the 99th percentile is a mile away from a school in another district. If we received the same funding as that district got, that school would be generating $1.4 million more. And so when we think about trying to serve those students at that particular school and compare that to really what's a neighborhood school that's very close by, I think it creates some unique challenges even when we compare. And if you read in the local media, they would say that's probably the lowest performing elementary school in the county. Well, if we were to compare it against others and the services that we could provide, we would say yes, that's the case. And then when we looked at how we are getting the dollars to the school sites, the other thing, we've looked at our unduplicated student count per school and actually allocated funds directly to the schools as well, so that even schools that we would be considered low need are still getting some funds to support those students, because those funds we have those students at all of our schools. But I think just that disparity makes it really challenging for us to serve our highest needs students. And I think, that's something that there are others, and Mr. Kirst spoke to that you have such a broad spectrum of high need districts. It is challenging to compare those.
And Samantha.
So I'm going to break your rule and actually do 2.
Sure.
The first is I am so grateful that Julian's done this research. It's something that the folks who are the architects of this work, we stood shoulder to shoulder with the Brown administration to make sure that this law got passed, actually helped with the communications. We are invested in its success. And I guess what I would say as one key takeaway, we shouldn't have needed this research. We have systematically not been willing to actually build the rocket. We've chosen to not monitor or guarantee, so it is no surprise that we're in the condition we're in. Secondly, my biggest takeaway, which was it was disheartening to me, and again, not surprising, is that the research shows 2 schools sitting next to each other in the district, and in fact, the patterns over time have not changed, right? We are still only slightly investing more in our high needs schools, still having predominantly novice teachers where we know there's a lot of churn, and it's not clear what additional supports are being provided for those schools. I think that's the next research, like what are we really doing to make sure we're keeping teachers and doing this important work. So that takeaway of that fundamentally over the last 15 years, we're not seeing different patterns when the whole goal behind the law was to get additional resources to the tune of $9.5 billion out to kids.
And getting on the subject of staffing, this report shed a light on the fact that, some of the general staffing trends haven't changed much under LCFF. The state's highest needs schools still generally have a heavier reliance on inexperienced teachers than the state's wealthier schools. So for Superintendent Kern, is this broader staffing trend something that bears out in your schools? And for the entire panel, how should local school leaders confront this issue under LCFF? And what does the state need to do to position low-income schools toward better retaining and attracting experienced and qualified teachers?
So I would say that we do see that in our schools in the district. But what I would say to you is I think we have tried to provide a very robust support system for our teachers. We invest heavily in an induction program. We have invested heavily in a new system for professional growth, which is an evaluation system. And through that, which really involves a partnership with our Teachers Association, Samantha and I were talking earlier, we really have a very, very strong partnership with our Teachers Association in our district. And I think it allows us to have conversations about how we're serving our students. And in the highest need school that I mentioned earlier, the one that's 99% free and reduced, in the last 2 years, this year we had no teachers opt out. It will have the exact same teaching staff next year as it did this year. The previous year, I think we had one teacher, and through the partnership with the Teachers Association, we actually implemented a co-teaching model last year so that all of our grades for K-3 have an additional teacher to support that classroom teacher in ELA and math. And so, that's a benefit for a regular classroom teacher to have that co-teacher, but we're trying to invest there. But I think with some of the steps that we've taken, we've seen less of a move away from the schools than maybe some other places.
And Dr. Kirst?
Yeah, there's a long literature on this, and it shows to me that teachers decide on what schools they want to teach in on more than salary. There's been I think back into the 70s, there was school districts and programs that offered so-called, quote, combat pay increases for teaching in high concentration poverty schools, and it really didn't attract many teachers just with the salary bumps. So the literature shows to me that there's a lot of other things that teachers think about when they choose the school they want to teach in. And therefore, it's very hard to get these teachers in more affluent schools sites to move over there. So I think you have to look then at the environment of the schools in terms of the principal, the nature of the morale of the staff, the general supports like Superintendent Kern talks about that are being provided there. It's a whole package of things. And so getting the salary differences doesn't exactly suggest that salary increases will be the sole way to solve this problem.
And Samantha?
To build on that point, Dr. Darling Hammond, who is now the current president of the state board and has overseen the work at Learning Policy Institute, actually came out with a really nice report under Getting Down to Facts that showed that if we addressed the retention problem in this state, we wouldn't have a teacher shortage. Right? So we're churning through teachers when they first come in. We've got to do a much better job at scale of the type of work that's happening in San Juan. And, that is incumbent on districts to own that and do that. It's also incumbent upon policymakers to figure out how do we enable it, right? And policy is a really blunt instrument. It's really, and the more nuanced you get with it, the more you're likely to mess it up, right? So how do we create a context where we're providing the resources, providing the right incentives, providing and shining a light on equity in very real ways, and doing that at scale. And it's actually the conversation we were having on the side of like, okay, let's brainstorm. Can we talk through like what's happening in San Juan and how do we think about that in the broader context of California?
That's great. And so moving forward, there's still pressure 6 years in from lawmakers and advocates such as yourself, Samantha, about tracking spending under LCFF at the school level. Julian mentioned, or the state audit that's underway has been mentioned previously. And so I'm wondering, how should we use data to inform better monitoring of LCFF? And is that would better monitoring necessarily make the funding formula more effective? We'll start with Samantha.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, there are things that the state can do right now, even before the legislature or governor need to step in. The CDE can, in fact, move forward with, for example, the federal law that Julian referenced of now it is required that districts account for resources at the site level. That data is likely to be horrible because the state made a decision that we weren't going to have any conversation about how to standardize that. Right, so I can tell you, I can look at the teachers and the support staff at that school and say, okay, that counts. Well, how do you count a coach? How do you count a nurse who's moving around? Shouldn't we count that? And shouldn't we count that in a systematic way? How do we think about district support in a nuanced way to really understand the types of resources that kids are accessing? And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what advocates want. I have no interest in bean counting. I want to see the trends. I want to make sure that trend line that Julian lifted up over the last 15 years is a different trend for kids, because we know that's the only way we're going to have an impact on their outcomes. And I'll just leave it at that.
And Dr. Kirst?
Yeah, I would agree with those comments in that regard. And one of the big needs we have, let's take in mathematics, I just read something that not many people read called the West Ed study of math in common. The Bechtel Foundation spent $50 million on 10 districts to improve mathematics. And WestEd wrote a report about that thick. And you got to read the details and not the highlights. But we're struggling in math as a state, no question about it. And so you get back to how to improve the classroom instruction through helping the teachers to teach the new Common Core math. And a lot of that spending will show up as a district expenditure, mounting professional development programs at the district level. And so if those district programs are for professional development are then recorded there, then, you know, we're going to miss what's going on in a very important area. So I think this is a very deep problem, as I indicated in my opening remarks, and we're no closer to, we need a very big effort to step back and reconceptualize this. The national government, our federal government, still wants these old categories. So we have to build in new ones for California.
You know, one of the challenges that occurs at a school site, and districts struggle with this as well, is we don't pivot real well. We start one direction and we have to create our plan. And at the school site, you may develop your SPSA, and here's how we plan to spend our money. And something happens that could be as simple as, we plan to hire this individual. Now we're not able to hire that person as soon as we want. They're going to use the supplemental funding that the district has given them, and they want to pivot off of that, and it's not easy. And so what we find happening at school sites sometimes is then in the end those dollars go unspent. And so I think if we really wanted to allow there to be greater transparency at the school site, we'd also have to understand that there needs to be kind of less bureaucracy in what we have to report out in the first place, because that alone, I think, makes it really difficult to move off of the plan that they've submitted in the first place.
And, you know, another thing that this report kind of touched on was, you know, LCFF was designed to help school districts with large concentrations of disadvantaged kids. You know, but as the report notes, allocating LCFF funding based on district level need is imperfectly targeting high-need students attending wealthier school districts. So should the state study or examine whether to allocate LCFF funding based on school site level needs? And, you know, does that erode the spirit of local control that, you know, the local control funding formula provides? And we can start with Dr. Kirst.
Yeah, well, I think the opening remarks of Superintendent Kern and myself diverge here and will continue to diverge. And I think it goes back to the theory of concentration, and that his problems are real. I understand that. But again, if you go to Elk Grove, look around, go to Stockton, look around, they're different. The levels of violence in Stockton are way above Elk Grove. I mean, it's not even close in that regard, just to give you one interaction effect here. So I think if you, you know, I would support, my answer to your question is no. I would continue to support the theory of concentration, and I realize there's trade-offs. No public policy will satisfy every objective. You got to make choices. That's part of leadership. We did it. I would stay with it.
Superintendent Kern.
Well, one of the challenges in this, when this all came out, is we talked as districts throughout the state that there were winners and losers. And one of the things is, you know, that's what I don't think any of us want to see, that we see districts that would be losers. It would benefit our district to look at that, because we would be getting concentration dollars for some of those schools. Would it, in some other districts, then we would have to take dollars. It's the same pot of money, so we'd have to look at it. Now, what are the challenges that creates? So I don't know if, I think we would. My simple answer would be yes. You know, Dr. Kirst is no, and I understand completely why, looking at it from a larger state system perspective. But I think the challenge we have is meeting the needs of some very, very high need students at a lower funding model creates some unique challenges for us.
Samantha.
And what I'd say is I'm absolutely sympathetic to the dynamic of that school, right? I mean, that's where kids are feeling it. They're feeling it at their school site, and that school site absolutely needs additional supports and services and us resourcing them. I think where we came down as we were having the conversation around the finance formula is having real concerns about moving to a site level model that could create very perverse incentives. So, you know, if a borderline could be drawn that allows for deeper concentration, that draws down more state dollars, that is not the policy we want in place. We don't want to perpetuate segregation. So how do we think about the needs of all kids and resourcing students, but not create perverse incentives? So that, you know, I think from a policy perspective, that was the trade-off that we were comfortable with. But I absolutely sympathize and understand it.
And, you know, when we think about the big picture reason for why California enacted the local control funding formula, you know, to elevate student outcomes and help close the achievement gap, you know, 6 years in, how would each of you rate or assess the effectiveness of the local control funding formula in that respect? And Dr. Kirst, if you want to start.
Well, in terms of one additional perspective to this study would be in terms of gauging just the resource allocations from the state to the school districts, would be to highlight individual school districts. When Goodwin and Lou and I worked on the underpinnings of LCFF, we chose 40 to 50 school districts that were all over the map and then looked at precisely how much money they got. This study puts all of the 55% in districts all in one bucket, but I would judge it by, and like to see more, frankly, on how it's affecting different districts, comparing Stockton and others at the high end, how much money they got, how much, what they spend it on, what do their teacher salaries look like, and then compare that to, say, districts that are at 57% of poverty. And I think Elk Grove's been in the concentration before in that regard. So that's one thing that I would say I would look at on that level. I don't think, you know, there are media people that say, well, LCFF was supposed to solve the achievement gap, and if it doesn't do that, you know, and then it's not working. And I think that's a really high standard. It takes more than money to do that. It takes a whole lot of other things. I think improving mathematics, when you get done with that study, it's a moldable strategy. So I think that's important. And I think that we need to, in the future, have a little bit more focus in LCFF on some of the key areas that we're really lagging in, and my big area is mathematics. I'd like to see more focus on that at the local level, and more focus in the system of support which we mounted to bring that about.
How about for yourself, Superintendent Kern?
Yeah, I think, you know, we have almost 22,000 students in our district that fit that targeted category. And I absolutely believe that this has brought attention and supports to those students that it previously did not. And so for that, I would say it has been a success for those students. Are we where we want to be? No. But we are, I even put my principal hat on from back in the day, and when I was a principal, if I had had the specific data at my school related to these students, I think the conversations that I would be having with my teachers, utilizing the data, would be very targeted. And that's when we talk about the targeted assistance. And that's what we're trying to do, and I think we're making a difference. And when you talk about the local level, a district with 64 schools, and there are districts much larger than ours, a solution for students in Orangevale is not the same as a solution for students in the Arden Arcade area. So you have to have that discussion at the school level to meet those individual needs. And I think that is what has allowed us to do.
Samantha.
I think LCFF continues to be the absolute right vision. And as Superintendent Kern demonstrates, we are seeing bright spots across the state. I think the challenge with this new evidence shows that, you know, we have systematically in implementation made a decision not to shine a light on equity, and we're not seeing any fundamental broader patterns change. So now that we have this information, as we sit here in this emerging next legislative policy cycle. I think the question is, are policymakers going to make different decisions about whether or not we're ready to now shine a light on equity?
What, if anything, would any of you change about the local control funding formula at this juncture if you had the power to do so? Dr. Kirst.
Well, I would put more money in it. And I don't know whether this would work, but what I was struck by was how the Brown administration set a target, a 5 to 7 year target, to get state funding to a certain level. And it drove the administration's funding priorities, and we attained that target. So rather than bills that say we ought to be, in the top 10 in the nation or something, I would do something realistic, I think, and set another target for the next 5 to 7 years. A stretch goal, but reachable goal. And then try and reach that in that regard. So I would do that. I still think the trade-off between, quote, state and local control, I still lean to where we are now. I do agree on transparency, however, which is a major thing here. You can argue about how much the state should direct local spending. It's an entirely different argument to say whether the local spending is transparent or not. And so I do believe we need that, and so I support the report fully in its innovative tactics and strategies for getting some data here, which I think is the way they did it. What they did do is correct, and that we need, as I've said, a massive overhaul of how we think about school accounting.
Superintendent Kern.
Yeah, I think I kind of spoke to this earlier. I think there would be some threshold that schools that meet a certain percentage would receive some kind of concentration dollars. Those schools have massive needs, and the funds aren't there to provide all of the supports. We've even implemented MTSS centers throughout the district, and we've had to do it at 3 centers serving our medium and high-density students. And if there was more funding, more of those services that are split between multiple schools could be directly at that school. So say sharing a social worker or a mental health therapist between 2 or 3 schools, there would be dedicated staff at those schools.
And I would double down on Dr. Kirst's 2 suggestions, more money and transparency, and then I would add into the mix this deeper conversation that state leaders need to have about how do we enable and support schools in appropriate ways at the state level, so that we can see what San Juan is doing across California, and it not just be bright spots, but actually be a systemic approach in this state.
And we got time for one last question before we break it out to the audience. And so, for each of you, what you've talked on this obviously, but what would you say has been the biggest success of LCFF, and what's the biggest threat toward ensuring the funding formula's long-term success and effectiveness? Samantha.
The biggest success, I think it is we are actually having a conversation right now about high-need schools, right? We're looking at it, we're talking about it, we're recognizing that there are real challenges that we have not addressed fundamentally for a very long time, if ever. So I think that's a success. It's also a threat. If we don't actually step up and make sure that kids' outcomes, their opportunities and outcomes are any different, then what have we done?
The biggest success I mentioned, we have over 20,000 students that are in this group, and I think we have focused conversations about how we can meet those students' needs, where before at some sites they were lumped more into the broader student body. And so I believe that we're meeting the needs of those students. We're seeing some areas where we're seeing some real growth amongst some of those, but as Dr. Kirst said, we're still struggling mightily with math. So that's our biggest success. The challenge, I think, would be that individuals expect too much change too fast, because when you implement such a substantial change like this to how we fund schools, that takes change. We see the same at school sites. In order for us to implement change, the longer that I have an administrator at the site, I believe the biggest impact that person has, stability, and so I think we just need to stay the course.
Dr. Kirst.
Yeah, I think the biggest success was that it totally reconceptualized school finance. Let's flash back to 2012. You had 41 state categorical programs, and with very detailed specifications. So you had the whole system had no underlying rationale. It was an historical accretion of nonsense. About 8 people understood it in Sacramento, and they were very highly paid to understand it. It was a mess, and so at least we're dealing with something that's on the table. My current biggest threat that is that we omitted special education finance. And so I am now turning my attention to that. And I think that is in the same shape that that the whole system, LCFF, was in 2011. It's an historical accretion with no clear underlying rationale. We don't even know who's getting what money. When you finally run the money through the SELPAs, where's it going? I mean, at least you can find out the districts are getting the money, and so it's even more arcane. So, and that's eating, as PPIC's Paul Warren, who's here today, pointed out, we have the student. We have the student body growing like that, and our system is based on ADA, and we have special education growing like that, yet our formula is based on the student count. So this is a mess, and it's about 15 to 20% of our expenditures, and we've got to put the effort behind this, I think, in the future.
Real quickly, Governor Newsom, we really haven't heard much from him publicly regarding LCFF, but is that something that you would expect the governor to take on in the near future?
I have no idea. I don't know.
Fair enough.
I mean, he has nothing really to work with now. I mean, I don't know what I would, if he said, recommend something for me to put in the budget, I don't know what I'd say for next year. I mean, this is a job to be done here.
And we certainly want to leave enough time for audience questions. So if there are any folks in the audience who have a question, well, let's hear it.
Thank you. Speaking to the question about having an experienced teacher in a classroom, in all classrooms, are you aware of any policy movements to require districts have a balance of experienced staff at each of their schools, so that each school would have some beginning teachers, some middle career teachers, and some of the most experienced teachers? Is there any policy question about that?
That's not been part of the discourse, and I think partly it's because so much of that is determined at the local level through collective bargaining agreements, and in fact, the legislature can't really override those, so I don't think they've entered into the fray on that front.
So it's the teacher associations, really powerful.
It's the dialogue between the management and the associations. I mean, we see good examples, for example, in San Juan of those relationships playing out nicely, and I think it's still probably a challenge.
I'd like to supplement that. It's we have had that in the past. You can go, not enough people read education history. The 2 large cities tried to do what you're suggesting, and they were required to by courts. The District of Columbia in Hobson versus Hanson, and Los Angeles Unified School District in California. They had a policy to do this. They had a court order to do it down there. It was a disaster. The teachers didn't want to move into these schools or even move between schools, yet there were specific percentages set by the court. So LA was transferring teachers every year, and even in the mid-year, forcibly transferring them from where they were to another school they didn't want to be in. They got really bad results in terms of academic achievement and the teacher dissatisfaction. And so you've got to show me how you're going to do this before I would solely blame the unions. And read those 2 case studies. District Columbia was even worse. So, pushing people around where they're not prepared to be. A lot of the teachers with the higher salaries that they moved from the northwest San Fernando Valley to South Central, they had a lot of money, but they didn't know how to teach those kids. So look at history and you'll see it's complex.
Education is a human endeavor, and we've got to be thoughtful about the humans involved.
Superintendent, would you care to weigh in?
I wouldn't add anything else on that. I'm not aware of any legislation. I think they spoke to it.
Sure.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. Dr. Kirst, I always wondered about that in LAUSD, so now I know where to look. My question is actually kind of a follow-up for the superintendent. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little more to the history of how you've built the relationship that you have with your Teachers Association that would allow for more, I don't know, potentially informal work along the lines of what the gentleman was asking about.
Well, I think it really takes a lot of a commitment of time. It takes a commitment of effort. Our executive director of our Teachers Association, who Samantha was saying she works with on some things as well, Shannon Brown, I'm blessed to work with her. I meet with her and our president of our Teachers Association, Bill Simmons, twice a month. We have breakfast, we have lunch. Our meetings can be between 2 and 3 hours. We talk about everything. I probably text and talk with Shannon and Bill another 10 to 15 times a month. I really, really believe that if we are going to accomplish what we need to for the students in our district, we can't do it fighting each other. We need to do it in partnership. We had the opportunity to actually, when Dr. Kirst was on the board, present some information to the state board, and I invited Shannon to present with me. Next year we're presenting on our new evaluation system at CSBA. I'm not presenting, I asked Shannon to present with me. And so it is a true partnership. In fact, that's why we've moved past the term collaborating to a partnership. Because if you're partners with somebody, that's about anybody, when things go bad, you don't just say, forget it. You try and work through it. We don't always agree. I believe that has benefited us greatly when it comes to the bargaining table as well. But it's a lot of time and energy, but we are working together on initiatives to benefit students. The co-teaching model was directly a conversation between my current deputy of instruction and Shannon together, throwing out some thoughts, and that came from a conversation they had. And it is, I feel excited and blessed that we have that opportunity in San Juan Unified.
Hello. So a question for Julien and the panelists. So on figure 3 in the report and in the presentation, where we have the breakdowns between the 0 to 30, 30 to 55, and over 55, it's actually interesting to see that the funding levels are reversed between the 0 to 30 and the 30 to 55. You would expect the lowest to be 0 to 30, and then the second highest to be 30 to 55, and then the 55 and above. But that's actually for the 0 to 30 and 30 to 55, it's the reverse, meaning the higher income districts are getting more money than the secondary highest income. And that's been the same across the board. So I guess it's a two-tier question of why that's been the case before and after LCFF, but also we're seeing an almost flattening effect for the middle tier category, and I wonder why that is the case as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think just to get a little bit of context on that, so the 0 to 30 group is on average, I think, about 20-25% high need, and the 30 to 55 is maybe in the 40-45. So the actual LCFF formula difference isn't that large in terms of additional funding, and this, again, was just isolating student spending. So it's possible these districts are spending more in other categories like capital expenditures or even on pre-K and adult education, which I know has shown up in some LCAPs. Another point on that is that these districts could also be reserving some of their money too. So it's not necessarily the case that the funding formula isn't benefiting them, but I think it also speaks to some of what Superintendent Kern was talking about in terms of just not getting as much of a bump. And I think this also brings us back to the point Dr. Kirst raised earlier that I lumped together these 55 and above districts. That was a choice just born out of simplicity, in part because these are the districts we have identified as concentration districts, but he's absolutely right. If we were to zoom in just at those 80% and above, the impact of the formula is quite drastic and would be about twice the size. And so I think to the extent that we care about these high need kids in these more moderate need districts, I think there's conversations that ought to be had about different ways of doing this type of budgeting. But yeah, I think that answers most of it. Yeah. I don't know if anyone on the panel has something to add on that, but.
Questions?
I have one back here. As California approaches a recession and that there will likely be less funding at the state level, have any of you considered what does LCFF look like in terms of funding distribution and or the LCAP requirements, particularly around parent engagement and or the increase in improved service expectation? Because we talk about more money for LCFF if we have money, but what about during a recession?
Dr. Kirst.
Well, Samantha, why don't you comment, and then I'll comment. Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm not sure I quite understand. The question.
I think I understand. I know where Martha's coming from in that the from an administrative side, the LCAP feels like a lot. I mean, we were having that conversation too, right? There's 300 pages. You're going through it. You're trying to fix it update it every year. Are we going to keep the same processes in place? I almost think that's a different conversation than kind of the recession discussion, because I think that's a very real issue of how we think about the formula being implemented if resources are declining. How do you apply cuts in that context? So I think that's an important policy conversation, and I would bifurcate the two and talk about the LCAP construct as being something that we also need to work through, because that is trying to accomplish a whole lot of things in a PDF and it's not getting to any of them, right? It's not really supporting community engagement. It's not really supporting strategic planning. It doesn't get at the heart of the transparency issues many of us care about, but it's because we, by design, lumped them all together, and that was how the law was written, and it's how, the state board had to move forward in terms of implementing it. So, let's have that conversation too, but I think you're raising two issues, and I would tackle them differently. I don't know if there's anything else you'd add.
Dr. Kirst?
Yeah, I would say the LCAP is a work in progress. Still, it's been continuously improved every time that it has come up. But I keep thinking if there be one of the ideal changes would be to have maybe two different forms. One is just straight compliance, and the other would be more a strategic resource allocation part. When you put the two together, and there's other objectives in there, so I think it needs some fundamental redesign about that, how to handle the compliance versus the resource allocation area, and it's still evolving, and I think will be continue to be changed.
Superintendent, piggybacking on that, what is the engagement process? What does the engagement look like in your school district with parents, in the LCAP process?
Okay. First, let me just say to Martha, one of the things I would say to that is that when I mentioned that schools don't pivot as well as districts, we don't. But what we need to do is make sure we're looking at the data and where we're spending our dollars to make sure that we're getting results, so that if we do see a recession, we're able to know what is working and what isn't working. And then we're not making a foolish decision about where we have to cut. So we should be doing that every single year and not waiting for a recession. What does it look like in our district? We created a parent advisory committee, and our parent advisory committee has 20-some individuals on it that have a broad representation of the district. It even includes 4 students on that committee. We bring a lot of information to them, and then in the end, they make some recommendations to the board. They share some information with them, but along the way, we try to get feedback from as many folks as we can. So we bring schools together, and those schools see if they can get parents, staff, both certificated and classified staff. We do data equity walks where we have all kinds of data. We're looking at information at those. We did those last year 3 times throughout the course of the year. And then another piece that we've really tried to utilize is listening circles amongst our students. And so we've done this even as early as our elementary schools, but we go into our schools, get a group of students, and we usually have somebody much younger and cooler than me that kids will relate to. And they're much more transparent with those individuals. And we get a lot of information directly from students about the changes that they would like to see made. And we gather all of that information together, We're constantly sharing that with the board, and then we go to our bargaining partners as well and have conversations with them. So it really is a broad picture of how we try and involve everybody in that.
Hi, this is a question for Superintendent Kern. I was wondering if you could speak to capacity building resources that are housed at your central office that you are targeting towards some of your schools that might have specific needs. I don't know if the MTSS centers that you mentioned earlier might be an example of this, but things that you're doing that might not show up at a school level staffing, but are definitely working towards building capacity in your high need schools.
I think the MTSS centers is one example. Approximately, I think 4 or 5 years ago, I created a director of equity, and we started a whole equity department. And that equity department works in partnership with really our MTS folks as well. So that's something that would not show up as well. And then we also created a family and community engagement department. And if I've got a list of partnerships here over the last number of years that we have gotten involved with. For those of you, Improve Your Tomorrow is a group of two African-American young men who mentor African-American students. They have done amazing work in our district. They're actually graduates, I think, from one of the high schools in Elk Grove. And so through that FACE department, we've expanded our partnerships, and we could, if I had time, I could go through and point to all the things we're doing now that we weren't doing a number of years ago because of the funds that we have, and again, that are targeting specific groups of students.
I just want to thank all the panelists. My question revolves around the question of how do we support new teachers, especially if we, like we said, if we solve the retention problem, then we fix a lot of our other issues too. So at the local level, maybe the superintendent, you could speak to how you directly hear from those new teachers about what it is that they need to be supported. If it's not just money, what else is it? But then also thinking about the state level, we know it takes some time for people in their position to be comfortable and to kind of settle into an area where they can be more active and make their voice heard through the political process. So is there something we could maybe do or look to at the state level to make sure that new teachers' voices are represented and not just those people who have had the time to kind of ascend to leadership positions and the associations and have kind of the space to be a little bit more active?
Well, at our level, I mentioned the induction program that we have. So all of our new teachers for the first 2 years have consulting teachers that work with them. So those teachers are going into their classes, they're supporting those teachers, they're having those conversations exactly. So what do they need? That's a conversation between somebody. And when you have a consulting teacher who works with you for 2 years and you can trust them when you have a flaw or you have an area that you're weak and they're going to support you in that, that really, I believe, supports a system that's trying to support the teachers. If we have constant turnover, that's not going to benefit our students. We hired over 200 new staff this year. We've averaged the last couple of years between 150 and 200 plus. And so that induction program is so important for us. Interestingly enough, we've found that we're getting a lot of individuals who have more years of experience who are coming to our district, and we're providing support for those teachers as well, just so that helps them kind of integrate into our system. And so what I would say at the state level is if there were more dollars to support districts to implement that, who haven't done that in the past, it's hard because it is a sizable investment, but it's something we chose to do a number of years ago, and we didn't cut it when times got tough.
And building on that, I mean, one of the ways the state has tried to respond in the local control context and really respecting and supporting communities as they're trying to figure this out is not to come in with, predefined PD, right? But we still have to have a system at scale that's going to provide true support. And so there's work at the state level between CDE, State Board, the new California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, the counties, to construct a statewide system of support. Now that has been, to date, very much at the macro level. There's been some deep dives in districts to try and figure this out. This recent budget allocates some resources for teacher support, for leadership support, how that gets baked in, how we think about it at scale, how we engage and support novice teachers in that, I think we're trying to figure it out. And it's this is hard work, and it's not work that we've ever done, let alone done successfully. So we've got to figure it out, and we need the advice and counsel from those on the ground who are actually implementing practice and trying to do the important work of serving kids.
Yeah, pre-service training goes into this as well. The state has provided significant resources for teacher residencies where teachers really spend a lot of time as they're being prepared in the district, and I'm sure you have some of these. And so that helps your induction because they're already been there in their teacher residency pre-service training.
I love the idea of more funding and more transparency, and it's really interesting to see how the funding has gone up and then down and then up again. Do we have information about the correlation between funding and achievement?
Well, there is the Berkeley study the getting down to facts study, and there's a professor in the University of California at Berkeley who did such a study and found positive effects from the spending and on student attainment. Name is Rucker Johnson, and that study is available through the PACE Center at Stanford University, which did the getting down to facts overall coordination and leadership.
And what I would say, what we know to be true is that money matters, right? Like there may not be a direct correlation. I think, again, Dr. Darling-Hammond did a nice job making the case at LPI. There's a nice piece that lays out money matters. And what I would share is that we've actually been looking a little bit at different state effort to invest in public education. Like what are states willing to tax themselves in order to support public schools? And in California, we're at like 3% GDP. If we decided to move in a direction where we were more comparable to, say, New Jersey, who's at 4.8% GDP, that would mean an additional $45 billion more for public education in California. It's choice. And we've chosen not to resource public education at that same level. We can make different choices.
Hi. Well, I just wanted to say, in terms of getting up to the New Jersey levels, don't hold your breath, most likely. But my question is, like, two questions for Julien and Michael. And I was wondering if the local control funding formula has had success in equalizing the amount of funding across school districts of different resources in California compared to other states. So has it been effective in equalizing the funding? And then my second question is actually about school fundraising by parent-teacher organizations and the like across different districts, and whether it's possible to gather and track information on levels of that activity and spending for different districts to get. And I don't think that that data is included in these figures, but I was wondering if it's possible to collect information on that.
Yeah, I can answer the first part, and then there are national studies. There's 2 or 3 just out comparing California and where it's come. And the general overall conclusion is that we've made significant strides in equalization of funding, and we rank relatively high among the states in equalization. However, we get dinged terribly on adequacy. So, you've got this two-headed problem, and we're only dealing with one side of it. And so we generally then, it's a tale of two things as you look at it. As far as I know, we're the only state that uses the kind of concentration factor we use. Other states have weights, but they're not as progressive, as you will, as you go up the poverty areas, percentage and concentration. So that is unusual. I don't know of any tracking of the foundations, and I probably would have seen it. So I continue to think it's, other than examples which people point out, like Hillsborough, California, and some very wealthy place, in the total budget, if it's 100%, this money's like 2%, or even at, Hillsborough gets up to 5 to 7, but that's Hillsborough. So, generally it's not that much money, but it does make a point at the margin, and the parents really care about it, that's for sure. We don't have a way we cannot get to the parental base of our people in California they do want higher spending, and they have no way to get it locally other than the parcel tax. And so we've severed the connection. When I first started studying school finance in the 70s in California, the low spending districts chased the county average. The county average the wealthy districts would pass these property tax increases. They get way ahead. And they still were ahead. But at least you had the local thing that we've got to get up to at least the average in Santa Clara County. And that was an argument. Now that's really disappeared. You can't use a parcel tax to do that very well.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Dr. Kirst said about the difficulty in tracking these types of PTA dollars. It's, at the end of the day, hard to follow, and it's not a large percentage of spending overall, and it tends to be clustered in a few places. Back to your first question about where we fall in the national distribution, I don't know off the top of my head where we fall, but we've definitely improved in terms of how we're kind of targeting additional resources to higher need places. Other states have actually had large successes with reforms similar to LCFF through the 90s and 2000s. There was this whole school finance reform movement, a second wave of it that was really grounded in adequacy rather than just equalizing funding, but actually providing compensatory funding to places with higher need. And there's an emerging literature, and this touches on an earlier question about the correlation between achievement and spending. There actually are quite a number of studies now that are using these types of reforms that are similar to what happened in California, and finding that the money that was targeted to these low-income districts actually did end up making a difference in terms of things like test scores, educational attainment, adult earnings later in life, and even things like intergenerational mobility. So I think there is an emerging consensus that not only does money matter kind of in an abstract sense, but quantitatively we can pick up these effects over the long run with these types of reforms we've had.
Yeah, just a quick add-on to this. Our problem in adequacy is we're chasing the housing bubble. They adjust for costs of living. And, my home state's Pennsylvania. The housing there's flat. I can get you a very nice house for $40,000, $50,000. The average house in Cleveland, Ohio costs $146,000. We go up double digits in housing. Then they adjust nationally for our cost increases, which are heavily driven by housing. So you're chasing your tail. If the housing prices would flatten out, we do much better in terms of gaining ground with the LCFF increases we've made nationally. So I don't know what we can do about this housing situation, but it's a problem.
Any other questions? Well, on that note, I want to thank the Public Policy Institute of California for hosting this discussion, and thank you to Julien for his report. If you haven't seen it, it's online at the PPIC website, and thank you all for joining us today.
See you too. So you think if we got up to 75, if he split it by 75, we'd